The morning Nora Callahan walked into the federal courthouse without a single ally beside her, every bench in the public gallery was already taken. Reporters with press badges, former business acquaintances, and strangers who had once recognized her face from magazine features, they had all come to witness what they were certain would be a very public collapse. Every attorney she had paid, every firm that had deposited her retainer checks, had quietly slipped away before sunrise. She sat in the tiled hallway with nothing left but a case folder and a reputation that nobody seemed willing to defend anymore. Then a man in a plain, slightly worn suit placed a battered briefcase on the seat beside her and said 4 words that changed the direction of everything. "I've read the file." Nora Callahan had built her company from a single leased room in the Harbor District. By the time she turned 27, it was valued at more than most people could dream of earning across multiple lifetimes. She had appeared on the covers of 2 national business publications, had delivered keynote addresses at conferences where men, twice her age, leaned forward and took notes, and had made every significant decision inside that company with a precision that left very little room for second-guessing. She was not the kind of woman things happened to. She was the kind of woman who decided what happened. That was the version of herself she had trusted completely. Right up until the morning she found herself sitting alone in a courthouse hallway, understanding with cold clarity that the version no longer held. The charges had arrived without anything that felt like a real warning, or rather, they had arrived wrapped in such dense legal language that they hadn't felt real until they already were. Financial manipulation. Concealment of unauthorized transactions. The documents were thick. The timestamps were damning. Every signature that carried weight in those records bore her name, her credentials, or her authorization code. Her board said nothing publicly. Her partners stopped answering calls within 48 hours. The law firm she had relied on for 3 years formally withdrew, citing a conflict of interest that had somehow escaped their notice until that exact moment. 2 additional firms followed within the week, each offering a different excuse that amounted to the same calculation. This case was unwinnable, and nobody wanted their letterhead attached to the wreckage. By the morning of the first preliminary hearing, Nora was alone. She sat in a corridor chair with a leather folder across her lap, and the particular stillness of a person who has exhausted every move available to them. She could hear the gallery filling on the other side of the courtroom doors, the low hum of voices, the scrape of chairs, the ambient sound of a crowd gathering to watch something fall. She had spent years learning to walk into rooms and command them. She had no instruction manual for sitting still and disappearing. That was when Daniel Webb placed his briefcase on the chair next to her. It was an old briefcase, the kind with corners that had softened over years of use, a latch that had been repaired at some point and bore the evidence of it. He sat down without asking permission and without leading with credentials the way attorneys usually did. He simply settled in, released the latch, and set a manila folder on top of the stack already open across his knees. He had the look of someone who had been awake since before 4 in the morning because something in a set of documents had refused to let him rest. "I've read the file," he said, not as a sales pitch. Not as an introduction, as a simple fact. Nora looked at him the way she had learned to look at people who appeared in spaces without being invited. With a surface calm that concealed rapid internal assessment, she did not recognize him. He was not the type she would have sought out. His suit was clean but not expensive, his posture steady but entirely unpracticed, and there was nothing in his presentation that suggested he was accustomed to being taken seriously in rooms like this one. She had worked alongside partners who wore confidence like tailored armor. Daniel Webb wore something quieter, and for reasons she couldn't immediately articulate, harder to dismiss. She asked who he was, he told her. Daniel Webb, solo practice, mostly civil work out of a small office on the north side of the city. He had followed the case through news coverage, pulled the public filings, and spent the better part of 3 days working through every document he could legally access. No one had referred him. No one had sent him. He was there because the structure of the case had struck him as fundamentally wrong. Not wrong in the sense that Nora was necessarily innocent, but wrong in the sense that the evidence appeared to have been arranged. It was too orderly, too complete. Real financial crimes left friction. Loose ends, contradictions. This one had almost none. Nora said nothing for a long moment. The hallway had begun filling with courthouse personnel and attorneys moving between assignments, none of them paying any attention to the two of them. She studied Daniel's face the way she studied counterparts in negotiations, looking for the angle, the need, the thing they actually wanted underneath whatever they were presenting. What she found was something she was not prepared for. He was not looking at her the way a journalist sees a story or the way a lawyer sees a billing opportunity, or the way most of the people in her life over the past month had looked at her like a hazard to be avoided. He looked at her like a person who had landed in a very bad situation. That distinction, small as it appeared, landed somewhere unexpected. She asked him why he would do this. He had everything to lose and nothing obvious to gain. His professional standing in the legal community was not the kind that could absorb a high-profile failure, and everyone in that building had already concluded that this case was beyond saving by people with far more resources than he possessed. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He closed the folder on his knee, looked toward the courtroom doors at the end of the hall, and said that in his experience, cases that looked this airtight from the outside usually meant someone had worked extremely hard to make them look that way. He said he wasn't promising her a victory. He was telling her that something felt wrong, and he wasn't willing to walk away from that simply because it was complicated. It was not the speech she had anticipated. It wasn't a speech at all. And that, more than anything else, was what made her believe him. When the clerk called her name 20 minutes later, Nora Callahan walked through those courtroom doors with Daniel Webb at her side. He carried his worn briefcase. She carried nothing. The gallery went quiet. Every person in that room had already settled on how this story would end. Not one of them had considered the possibility that the man with the old briefcase had already found a crack in the wall they were all leaning against. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time. Hit that button and the bell so you never miss a story from SIF Stories. The legal community's response to Daniel Webb taking the case was not outrage. It was something quieter and more erosive than that. It was amusement. Within 2 days of the preliminary hearing, his name had traveled through enough firm corridors and courthouse lounges that people who had never met him felt entitled to form opinions. The consensus settled around two possibilities. He was either reckless or delusional, and neither was treated as especially interesting. The lead prosecutor, a razor-focused veteran named Victor Halle, made no effort to conceal his assessment. During the first formal session, he addressed Daniel with the specific brand of polished condescension that powerful men reserve for people they do not consider threats. He did not argue against Daniel's points so much as treat them as things that did unquite merit serious engagement. The unspoken message, delivered to everyone watching, was that Nora Callahan had finally run out of real options. Nora felt that message land. She sat beside Daniel at the defense table and kept her expression neutral the way she had trained herself to do in boardrooms. But something beneath the surface was shifting. She had spent her entire career being the most prepared person in any given room. She had never before been in a room that had already decided she didn't belong in it. Daniel, for his part, did not react to the treatment the way she expected. He took notes. He asked precise questions at the appropriate moments. He did not perform a confidence he didn't hold, and he didn't shrink from the condescension either. He moved through each session the way someone moves through a space they are still quietly mapping. Deliberate, unhurried, not announcing their direction. When they met afterward, he laid out what he had found in the financial records in the same tone he might use to describe a structural problem in a building, calm, specific, detached from the implications even when the implications were serious. What he had found was this. The transactions at the center of the charges had not been executed sloppily. They had been executed with precision, almost too much precision for the kind of internal turbulence that typically accompanied financial misconduct inside a fast-growing company. The timestamps were consistent. The authorization chains were intact. Every approval bearing Nora's name or digital credentials had been correctly logged, properly documented, and stored in exactly the right location. Daniel told her that in every real financial fraud case he had studied, genuine misconduct left behind at least some disorder, missed steps, records that didn't quite align with access logs. Here, there was none of that. Everything was in perfect order, which was, he explained, itself a form of disorder, because it meant someone had gone back afterward and made it perfect. Nora listened and understood what he was saying intellectually. Accepting the full weight of it was something different. If Daniel was right, if the records had been cleaned and arranged rather than simply generated, then someone inside her own company had done it. Someone with access to her authorization credentials, her approval systems, and enough internal knowledge to move through those systems without triggering any alerts. The list of people who could have done that was not long. Daniel raised the name of Marcus Fenn without framing it as an accusation. He walked through the timeline, first identifying the specific windows in which the flagged transactions had occurred, then cross-referencing them against Nora's documented schedule. In the majority of those periods, she had been traveling, presenting to the board, or otherwise removed from day-to-day financial operations. In those same windows, Marcus Fenn's access logs showed sustained, detailed engagement with the exact systems involved. Daniel did not say Marcus had done it. He said the record showed that whoever had acted had done so most heavily during the hours and days when Marcus' access patterns were highest and Nora's were lowest. The name hit her differently than she expected. Marcus Fenn had joined the company in its second year. He had designed the internal financial architecture, guided her through 2 funding rounds, and had been, for most of the company's existence, the one person she trusted to manage complexity without needing oversight. She had given him significant delegated authority precisely because he had always seemed to use it well. Sitting across from Daniel in a small conference room with a stack of printed access logs between them, Nora found herself tracing backward through years of decisions, conversations, and delegated responsibilities, trying to identify the moment when trust had quietly become exposure. She could not find it. That was the most unsettling part. The shift had left no footprint she could locate in hindsight. The central question of the case stopped being whether Nora had committed fraud and became something more tangled. Who had built this? Why had they built it around her specifically, and how deeply had it been embedded before anyone noticed? That question changed the way the two of them worked together. Nora stopped treating Daniel like a last resort and started treating him like someone who might actually be seeing something real. He stopped navigating around her pride and started asking direct questions about internal systems, delegation patterns, and the specific moments when she had extended Marcus' expanded access. Their conversations became longer, more specific, and less guarded on both sides. Then the pressure arrived from a different direction. A journalist published a lengthy profile that reframed the entire narrative, positioning Nora not as a specific person in a specific situation, but as a type. The young female founder who had risen too quickly, cultivated an image too deliberately, and used a combination of personal charisma and investor access to obscure operational problems that more seasoned executives would have caught. The piece did not accuse her of a crime directly. It didn't need to. It assembled enough detail, real detail, drawn from real conversations with unnamed former employees, to suggest that the charges fit an existing pattern of behavior rather than representing an aberration. The piece ran on a Sunday morning. By Monday, it had been cited in 3 separate follow-up articles. Nora read it twice. The second reading was worse than the first, because by then she had started recognizing which specific details had come from people who had been inside rooms she had considered private. Someone was still actively feeding information outward, she told Daniel. He added it to the map he was building, not of what had happened legally, but of who was still working to shape the outcome. Around the same time, 2 witnesses whose statements Daniel had been building toward began to shift their positions. The first was a former internal auditor who had flagged irregularities in a quarterly review. His original informal statement, captured in an email exchange Daniel had obtained through discovery, directly contradicted the version now on record. When Daniel attempted to follow up, the man's attorney responded that his client had no further comment and that the email had been taken out of context. The second was a mid-level finance manager who had been present during a key approval meeting. She had initially indicated a willingness to provide a clarifying statement about the chain of command. By the time Daniel formalized the request, she had retained new legal counsel and declined to participate. Daniel laid this out for Nora without commentary. He didn't need to add any. She understood what recanting witnesses meant in a case where the documentary evidence was already structured against her. It meant someone was still in contact with people who could affect the proceedings, and that person was working quickly. Then came the blow that nearly ended everything. Daniel had identified a set of original financial source documents, records predating the versions in the prosecution's evidence file, that showed the authorization chains in their unmodified state. These records, stored in a third-party audit archive, would have demonstrated clearly that certain approvals attributed to Nora had been inserted into the chain after the fact. He had built a substantial part of his courtroom strategy around them. When he submitted the formal request for their admission, the prosecution challenged the integrity of the archive's custody chain. The challenge was technical, narrow, and precisely targeted. The judge, after reviewing the filing, agreed that the chain of custody contained enough procedural gaps to render the records legally inadmissible. Daniel received the ruling on a Thursday afternoon. He sat with it for a long time before calling Nora. When she arrived, she could see it in the way he was sitting, not defeated exactly, but carrying something heavy. He told her what had happened in the same direct way he told her everything, without rounding the edges. The records were out. The witnesses were gone. What remained of the defense was structurally coherent but thinner than it had been, and Victor Halle would have the weekend to prepare for a closing phase that now tilted sharply in the prosecution's favor. Nora sat across from him and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel through any of it. Not when the board went silent. Not when the firms withdrew. Not when the journalists came. She felt the specific, settled weight of having been completely wrong about something she had been completely certain of. She had trusted Marcus Fenn with the architecture of her company's finances because he had seemed exactly like someone who deserved to be trusted. She had built her entire operation on her ability to read people, to know who was capable, who was reliable, who would hold under pressure. And somewhere along the way, that instinct had failed her so completely that she hadn't even noticed it fail. She told Daniel she thought she had made a mistake. Not about a specific decision, but about something larger, about believing that success was a reliable indicator of sound judgment. That being right enough times meant she couldn't be catastrophically wrong. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he did not try to argue her out of it or reassure her that she had done everything correctly. He said that people who built things tended to trust the people they built them with, and that the fault for what Marcus Fenn had done belonged to Marcus Fenn. He said it without sentiment, and it landed differently than sympathy would have. Then he told her there was still one thread he hadn't fully examined. Something small, embedded in the metadata of several flagged transactions. A logging anomaly he had flagged early and set aside because he had not been able to explain it at the time. Now, with everything else stripped away, it was the only element that didn't fit the story the prosecution was constructing. He didn't know yet whether it was enough. But it was something, and he was not prepared to walk away from something. Nora looked at him across the table. This man in his plain suit, with his careful handwritten notes and his old briefcase and his refusal to project certainty he did unactually possess. She understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be in a room with someone who was still trying when there was no longer an obvious reason to. She had known a great many successful people. She had not known many people like this. She told him to pull the thread. The thread Daniel had flagged was not dramatic on its surface. It was a metadata anomaly, a discrepancy in the system timestamps embedded within a cluster of internal approval records. On their own, the records appeared identical to every other approval in the chain. But when Daniel mapped the metadata against the company's server logs, something didn't align. The approval timestamps showed authorizations being granted in sequence, the way a person would move through a workflow in real time. The server logs, however, showed those same records being accessed and written in a pattern that was too uniform, too evenly spaced. The kind of spacing that occurred when an automated script ran on a schedule, not when a human being was clicking through an internal approval system at the end of a long workday. Daniel brought this to a digital forensics consultant he had worked with years earlier, methodical, unhurried man named Patrick Solis. who charged considerably less than the firms Nora had once retained but understood system architecture in ways that most courtroom experts did. Patrick examined the logs over 2 days and returned with a conclusion that was narrow, technically specific, and in context, devastating. The approval sequences attributed to Nora had not been entered by a human user in real time. They had been generated by an automated process, a script installed in the company's internal authorization system, configured to execute under specific conditions. The script had been placed there months before the transactions in question. Whoever installed it had required back-end system access that only a very small number of people inside the company had ever held. Marcus Fenn had held that access from the beginning. Daniel filed the forensic report with the court on a Monday morning and requested emergency consideration before the final hearing. The prosecution's response came quickly, and it was aggressive, but it was also reactive in a way that told Daniel the report had landed harder than Victor Hale's team wanted to show. The challenge focused on the admissibility of the forensic methodology rather than its conclusions, which indicated they were disputing the findings so much as trying to keep them out of the room. The judge allowed the report into evidence with conditions. It was enough. Nora learned all of this in the same conference room where Daniel had told her about the lost archive records. This time the weight in the room was different. She read Patrick Solis's findings twice, slowly, the way she read contracts when she was looking for the sentence that changed everything. When she looked up, she was not relieved in the way she had expected. What she felt was something more complicated and more cold, a clarifying anger at the precise shape of what had been done to her. Marcus Fenn had not simply moved money. He had spent months constructing a mechanism inside her own systems, designed to generate a record that looked exactly like her authorizing decisions she had never made. He had used her name, her credentials, and her company's architecture as raw materials for a project she had never known was underway. The precision of it was almost worse than the betrayal itself. She told Daniel she wanted to be present for every moment of the final hearing. He said she would be. The courtroom for the final session was quieter than the earlier ones, which made it feel larger. Victor Hale opened with the same structural confidence he had carried through the entire proceeding. Organized, authoritative, treating the defense's new evidence as a technical distraction from what he characterized as an overwhelming documentary record. He walked through the charges, methodically returned to the original financial records, and spoke about Nora Callahan in the third person with the practiced neutrality of a man who had made peace with her guilt long before the hearing began. Daniel did not open with argument. He opened with questions. He called Marcus Fenn to the stand. Fenn had provided a voluntary statement to investigators early in the case and had positioned himself throughout as a concerned senior employee cooperating with the inquiry. He took the stand with the composed, slightly pained expression of a man who had been reluctantly drawn into a situation he would have preferred to avoid. Daniel let him settle. Then he began from a point so far back in the timeline that Fenn's posture visibly relaxed. Daniel asked about the company's internal authorization systems, how they were designed, who had built them, how access levels were structured and assigned. Fenn answered with the fluency of someone explaining their own work. He was detailed, confident, and precise. That precision was exactly what Daniel had been building toward. He moved the questions forward in time, slowly, always framing them as clarifications of standard operating procedures. He asked Fenn to describe what a typical approval would look like in the system logs. Fenn walked through it. Daniel asked what the metadata for a human-entered approval would look like versus an automated process. Fenn explained the difference without appearing to understand why the question was being asked. Daniel then placed Patrick Solis's forensic report on the stand and asked Fenn to review the timestamp pattern on page 7. Fenn reviewed it. Daniel asked whether, based on Fenn's own description of how human approvals appeared in the system, the pattern on page 7 was consistent with a human user or an automated script. The question was quiet, specific, and it had no safe answer. Fenn said the pattern could be consistent with either, depending on conditions. Daniel asked him to explain what conditions would cause a human user to generate approvals at intervals of exactly 4.3 seconds across a sequence of 31 consecutive records. Fenn began a technical explanation that unraveled almost immediately under its own weight. because explaining it required him to describe user behaviors that no actual person would exhibit. The more specific he became, the more clearly the record contradicted him. Daniel did not interrupt. He let Fen finish. Then he placed the server access logs beside the forensic report and asked Fen to identify, in those logs, whose credentials had been used to install the authorization script that Patrick Solis had documented. The room went still in the specific way rooms go still when something moving quickly comes to a sudden stop. Fen said he was not familiar with the script. Daniel showed him the installation record. It carried an access credential assigned to Marcus Fen's administrative account. Log at 11:47 on a Tuesday evening, 8 months before the first flag transaction appeared. Fen said his credentials could have been used by others. Daniel asked him to name anyone else who had held administrative backend access at that level during that period. Fen could not name anyone, because there was no one. It had been his system, built by his hands, and the access had been his alone. Victor Halle objected 3 times during this exchange. The judge sustained one of them. It didn't matter. The shape of what had happened was already visible in the room, and visible in Marcus Fen's face. Not guilt exactly, but the particular tightness of a man whose carefully constructed version of events had just developed a fracture he could not explain away in real time. The remainder of the hearing moved differently than everything that had come before. Daniel did not speak about Nora's character or attempt to reframe her as a victim. He simply continued to follow the forensic record forward, transaction by transaction, showing where the automated script had fired and where Fen's access logs showed active engagement with the financial systems in those same windows. He was not telling a story, he was reading a record. And the record told its own story without any narrative assistance. The judge's ruling did not come that day. It came 4 days later, in a written decision that addressed the forensic evidence directly, and found it sufficient to substantially undermine the prosecution's entire chain of attribution. The charges against Nora Callahan were dismissed. A separate investigation into Marcus Fen and the conduct of certain company financial operations was formally opened by the end of the same week. Nora was standing outside the courthouse when she received the call. Daniel was beside her. She read the notification on her phone and stood with it for a long moment, not celebrating, not crying, simply absorbing the weight of something enormous that had finally stopped pressing down. The journalists who had covered her fall would cover her clearance. But she already understood that the coverage would be smaller, placed further back, less urgent. That was how it worked. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it before any of this began. She looked at Daniel and said, "Thank you." He nodded in the straightforward way he did most things. She told him she didn't mean only for the case. She meant for not treating her as the version of herself that the coverage had assembled, the overreaching executive, the cautionary symbol. He had treated her like someone who had been wronged, looked for the evidence that supported that, and followed it wherever it led. She said she was unsure anyone had ever given her that from a position of having no prior reason to be on her side. Daniel said he had just read the file. In the weeks that followed, Nora did not rebuild quickly. She moved through the work of restoring her company's operations with a deliberateness the person she had been before would barely have recognized. She restructured the internal authorization systems with external oversight built into every layer. She brought in a new financial leadership team and delegated authority more narrowly than she ever had before. Not because she trusted people less, but because she understood now that trust without structure was simply exposure with a more flattering name. The company survived. It came back smaller at first, then steadier. The steadiness felt more real than the growth she had once chased. Daniel returned to his office on the north side. The case brought him more attention than he had received in years, a handful of serious inquiries from clients with real legal problems, a quiet acknowledgement from corners of the professional community that had previously written him off. He did not pursue the attention aggressively. He took the cases that seemed worth taking and continued to work with the same methodical care he had always applied, in the same plain suit, carrying the same old briefcase. His reputation did not transform overnight into something unrecognizable. It simply became accurate again, which was all it had ever needed to be. The last time Nora and Daniel spoke, she said something she had been turning over for weeks. She told him that during the worst stretch of everything, the week after the archive records were ruled out, when she had genuinely believed the entire case was lost, what had kept her from walking away was not optimism. It was watching him refuse to stop looking, not because he had promised her a specific outcome, but because he seemed constitutionally unable to leave a question unanswered when he believed the answer was still somewhere in the record. She said she had spent her entire career surrounded by people who projected certainty. She had never understood until now how much certainty could be a form of laziness, a way of stopping work before the hard part arrived. Daniel considered this and said that in his experience, the cases that looked the most finished were usually the ones where someone had worked the hardest to make them appear that way. She had heard him say something close to that once before, in a courthouse hallway on a morning when nothing else remained. It had meant one thing then. It meant something deeper now. He picked up his briefcase and she watched him walk to his car, unremarkable, unhurried. Exactly as he had appeared that first morning, except that enough had shifted in the world that she now understood precisely what that appearance contained. Some people carry their worth loudly, in the cut of their clothes, in the names they drop, in the scale of the offices they keep. Daniel Webb carried his in the quality of his attention, and in the simple, durable fact that when everyone else had already decided how the story ended, he had kept reading. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you are subscribed to SIF Stories so you never miss what comes next.